There is a moment in every great erasure when the world forgets that something was ever there. The sand does not announce itself, it simply accumulates grain by grain, season by season, until the shape of what existed beneath it becomes a rumour, and then a legend, and then nothing at all. That is what the Sahara has done to us, to the record of what this earth was capable of before the version of history we were handed decided where the story began. The Sahara Desert stretches nearly 9.5 million square kilometres across the northern face of Africa. It is defined by its emptiness, by the silence of its dunes, by the absence of water in a place that now receives less than 25 millimetres of rain per year. It is defined by the complete and convincing appearance that nothing was ever here, that this has always been wasteland, that the sands are original and permanent. Every part of that appearance is false. There is a body of evidence so substantial and so systematically avoided in mainstream discussion that engaging with it fully requires a particular kind of discomfort. Not the discomfort of fringe speculation, but the discomfort of realizing that the framework you were given for understanding the past was designed around what it chose to exclude. The Sahara was not always a desert, and the transition from what it was to what it is now did not happen without leaving behind the traces of everything it swallowed. We are going to follow those traces, and we are going to ask the question that geological records, satellite imagery, ancient cartography, and suppressed archaeological findings all converge on. What civilization was living in the Sahara? What did it build? And what happened in 1815 that buried it so completely that the world we inherited has no memory of it at all? The greening of the Sahara is not a theory. It is not contested science. It is an established geological and climatic reality confirmed by sediment cores, fossilized pollen samples, lake bed deposits, and the bones of hippopotamuses found hundreds of kilometers deep in what is now some of the driest terrain on Earth. The African Humid Period lasted from approximately 11,000 years ago to roughly 5,000 years ago. During that time, the northern and central portions of the continent received reliable monsoon rainfall. Rivers flowed, lakes expanded to remarkable sizes. Vegetation covered landscapes that today are indistinguishable from the surface of Mars. People lived here, not in small, scattered nomadic bands. People built here, communities formed, grew, sustained themselves across centuries, and left behind material traces that the desert has not entirely succeeded in hiding. The question the official timeline would prefer you not examine too closely is how sophisticated those communities actually were, and what accounts for the staggering discontinuity between what the archaeological record suggests and what the history books allow. In 1850, a German explorer named Heinrich Barth was travelling through the Fezzan region of modern Libya when he encountered something that stopped him entirely. He found paintings on rock faces depicting cattle drives, swimming figures, boats on open water, and animals that had no business existing in a waterless desert. The images were not crude, they were compositionally sophisticated, layered in narrative sequences, rendered with an understanding of proportion and perspective that implied a tradition. An inheritance of artistic knowledge passed through generations of people who lived in a place radically different from the one that surrounds those paintings today. Those images at Tassili Najer, the plateau formation in the Algerian Sahara, now number in the tens of thousands. Painted across an area of roughly 72,000 square kilometers, they document a world that existed in parallel to the civilizations history taught us to treat as foundational. Egypt gets the pyramids, Mesopotamia gets the city, and the Sahara gets a footnote about nomads who painted some interesting things before the rain stopped. That is the story the timeline requires. What it does not account for is Nabta Playa. Located in the southern stretch of the Egyptian Sahara, Nabta Playa is a dried lake basin that has produced archaeological evidence so far outside the acceptable parameters of the conventional narrative that researchers have spent decades arguing about how to categorize it. The site contains a stone circle aligned to astronomical events, megalithic standing stones in precise geometric configurations, cattle burials indicating sophisticated ritual practice, and evidence of organized communal activity dating back more than 7,000 years. The stone circle at Nabta Playa predates Stonehenge, it predates the emergence of the dynastic Egyptian state, and it was built by people living in the middle of what is now open desert on the shores of a lake that no longer exists. Under a sky they understood with enough precision to align stone monuments to the summer solstice sunrise. The researchers who have worked at Nabta Playa describe a level of astronomical and organizational sophistication that should, by the logic of mainstream timelines, not exist here. The complex alignments, the subterranean structures carved into bedrock suggesting not improvisation but accumulated knowledge. Not a people stumbling into organization, but a people inheriting it. Where does that inheritance lead? That is the question the sand has buried, because Nabta Playa is not an isolated anomaly. It is one node in a network of sites stretching across the central and northern Sahara that together suggest not scattered prehistoric communities making independent discoveries, but something more coherent, more connected, more like what we would recognize if we found it anywhere else as civilization. The Garamantian civilization of the Fezzan, which historical sources in the classical world acknowledge but consistently treat as minor and marginal, built one of the most sophisticated hydraulic engineering systems ever constructed in the ancient world. Beneath what is now Libyan desert, the Garamantes dug thousands of kilometers of underground aqueducts called fogaras. These were engineered tunnels, some running for dozens of kilometers, tapping fossil water aquifers and channeling it to surface agricultural settlements with a precision that required advanced surveying, sustained organizational capacity, and a multi-generational commitment to infrastructure that only complex settled societies produce. The Garamantes built cities, they farmed, they traded across the desert, and they built underground water highways in a landscape already drying out, a civilization clearly adapting to a planet that was changing beneath their feet. The classical sources who mentioned them treated the Garamantes as exotic curiosities at the edge of the known world. That framing tells you what the official story chose to center. Engineering traditions of that scale do not emerge fully formed from populations with no prior experience of organized infrastructure. The Garamantes were inheriting something, working within a tradition of hydraulic management and collective labor that extends backward into the period when the Sahara was still green. There are geometric earthworks visible in satellite imagery that do not match natural formation processes. There are road-like structures in the Libyan desert running for hundreds of kilometers in near-perfect straight lines through terrain that supports no population today. The dunes have not yet fully covered them, but they are working on it. Now we come to 1815. In April of 1815, on the island of Sumbawa in what is now Indonesia, a volcano called Mount Tambora erupted with a force that dwarfs almost every other volcanic event in recorded human history. The eruption released approximately 160 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere, generating an ash column that spread across the entire planet within months. The following year, 1816, became known as the year without a summer. Global temperatures dropped, harvests failed across Europe, North America, and Asia. Famines followed. Entire migration patterns across the northern hemisphere were disrupted by a single volcanic event on the other side of the world. This is all in the official record. What the official record does not pursue is what that atmospheric disruption did to the Sahara, to a region already balanced on the edge of habitability, and what it buried in the collapse that followed. The Sahara had not always been as dead as it appears today. Even in historical periods, large portions of what is now classified as hyper-arid desert contained remnant populations, remnant water systems, and remnant settlements that desertification had not yet fully swallowed. Communities in the Fezzan, settlements in the Ahaga. people living in the margins of a landscape that had once supported millions, still working the inherited systems of water management their ancestors built during the Green Period, maintaining those systems with the stubborn continuity that settled populations always display against slow environmental change. The Tambora eruption did not cause a slow change, it caused a collapse event. The atmospheric disruption cascaded through global weather systems in ways that were catastrophic and uneven. The monsoon systems that still, even in 1815, delivered occasional seasonal rainfall to portions of the Central Sahara shifted abruptly. Surviving populations had no capacity to adapt because the disruption was not gradual but sudden, not a worsening trend, a threshold crossing. What followed was a depopulation event that does not generate the documented historical record that survives. The people living in the marginal Saharan territories in the early 19th century were not connected to the administrative and archival systems that produce paper trails ending up in archives. When they were displaced or killed by crop failure and famine, they left no account. Their absence from the record is not evidence that they were never there. It is evidence of what kinds of absence the record was designed to capture and what kinds it was designed to ignore. And then the sand came. Because without the shallow-rooted vegetation still holding portions of the Saharan surface in place, in 1815 the dunes began to move at rates not seen in centuries. The remaining infrastructure, the remnant aqueducts and settlements and earthworks that had survived the long, slow drying of the past 5 millennia, began to be buried at a pace no longer geological but historical. Not 10,000 years of sand, decades. There are maps produced before 1815 that show features of the North African interior that cannot be explained by simple cartographic error. There are maps showing river systems in the Central Sahara that correspond to drainage channels now visible only in satellite radar imaging. Features buried beneath the sand that no cartographer in the 18th century could have known were there unless those river systems were still, in some form, observable. There are maps showing settlements and routes in the interior that the post-1815 record treats as empty wilderness. The standard explanation is that early cartographers were unreliable, that they repeated errors from source to source, and that the correspondence between their depictions and what we can now see beneath the sand is coincidental. That explanation becomes increasingly difficult to sustain the more examples you examine. The Piri-Reis map, produced in 1513, contains features of the African coastline and interior that continue to generate debate among cartographers who cannot fully account for their accuracy. The accumulated cartographic tradition of the early modern period contains, embedded within it, a spatial knowledge of the African continent implying access to source materials we have not been told about, and that in several cases correspond with uncomfortable precision to features only now becoming visible through satellite and ground-penetrating radar. In 2000, a team using space shuttle radar imaging identified what became known as the radar rivers, a network of ancient watercourses beneath the Saharan surface in northeastern Africa. Large river systems capable of sustaining significant populations now buried under meters of sand. Their existence was not disputed, their implications were. Because if those river systems were active during the period when the Garamantes and their predecessors were building civilization in the Sahara, then the resource base available to those civilizations was radically larger than the official account allows. And if those river systems were still partially functional in the early 19th century, then what 1815 buried was not an ancient empty landscape, it was a living one. The question is what that living landscape contained. What architecture? What infrastructure? What knowledge in the form of built systems, of arranged stone, of organized space? How much of it was above the sand line when Tambora erupted, and how much dropped below that line in the decades that followed? Why does this matter? Because the story of where civilization came from determines what we think civilization is possible of. If the Sahara contained for thousands of years a network of organized settlements, a tradition of hydraulic engineering, an astronomical knowledge sophisticated enough to align stone monuments to celestial events, and a continuity of cultural practice rich enough to cover tens of thousands of square kilometers of rock face with representational art, then the story of human organizational capacity before Egypt, before Mesopotamia, is a different story than the one we were handed. And if the events of 1815 buried the last living remnants of that tradition under sand, then what we call the historical record is not a record of what existed. It is a record of what survived the burial. Those are not the same thing. And the distance between them is measured in meters of sand, pressing down on a world that was here before the desert decided to cover it. The dunes are not empty. They are archives. The largest filing system in the world for a civilization that no authorized institution has fully committed to recovering. What they contain is still being revealed by satellite imaging, by ground-penetrating radar, by the slow and unfunded work of researchers who understand that the official picture and the actual picture are not aligned. The sand is patient. It has waited this long. And the question is whether we are willing, before it settles further, to ask it what it is holding.